Welcome to Mindset, your destination for rewiring the mind to recognize truth and see the world with clarity. Today's topic, Islam and sex slavery. Get ready for evidence, context, and clarity. Let's begin by addressing a question that sits at the intersection of religion, history, and human rights. Does Islam permit sex slavery? To answer this honestly, we must confront the evidence embedded in its foundational texts, the Qur'an, Hadith, and Islamic jurisprudence, rather than rely on modern apologetic. The truth is not found in cherry-picked verses or sanitized reinterpretations, but in the unbroken chain of doctrine, law, and practice that has defined Islam for over 1,400 years. Start with the Quran, the literal word of Allah according to Muslims. It never condemns slavery. Instead, it institutionalizes it. Consider chapter 2, verse 221. Do not marry idolatresses until they believe. A believing slave woman is better than an idolatress, even though she pleases you. Here, the Quran acknowledges the existence of enslaved women, believing slave women, as a normalized category of human property. But the most damning verses are those that explicitly permit sexual relations with slaves. Chapter 23, verses 1 to 6 state, "The believers must succeed who guard their private parts, except from their wives and those whom their right hands possess." This phrase, "those whom your right hands possess," is a recurring euphemism in the Quran, also seen in chapter 4, verse 24, chapter 70, verse 30, that unambiguously refers to enslaved people, particularly female captives. The implication is clear. Owning slaves is lawful, and sex with them requires no marriage contract. To grasp the full weight of this, we must examine the historical context. In pre-Islamic Arabia, slavery was rampant, but Islam did not abolish it. Instead, it regulated and sanctified the practice. Chapter 4, verse 3 encourages Muslims to marry what your right hands possess if they fear poverty, framing slave ownership as a divine solution to social and economic challenges. Meanwhile, chapter 33, verse 50 grants Muhammad exclusive access to female captives of war, setting a precedent for believers to follow. When Muslim armies conquered cities like Khaybar and Adas, they seized women and children as spoils of war, enslaving them as permitted by chapter 47, verse 4. When you encounter the disbelievers, strike their necks until you have thoroughly subdued them, then bind them firmly. Captives were then distributed among soldiers, often as sex slaves. But how did this translate into practice? The Hadith, the recorded actions and sayings of Muhammad, provides explicit examples. In Sahih Bukhari, Volume 3, Hadith 432, Muhammad is described purchasing, selling, and owning slaves, including Maria al-Qibtiyya, an Egyptian Christian concubine who bore him a son. Another hadith in Sunan Abu Dawud, Hadith 2150, recounts a man boasting about impregnating his slave girl. Muhammad's response? "She is yours if you impregnated her." No condemnation, only validation. Similarly, in Musnad Ahmad, Hadith 22038, a companion asks if he may have sex with his slave without waiting for her menstrual cycle to end. Muhammad replies, "Do as you wish, for they are your possessions." The normalization of sex slavery extends to Islamic law. All four major Sunni schools of jurisprudence, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, agree that owning slaves is permissible and that sexual relations with them require no marriage contract. The Reliance of the Traveler, a widely respected manual of Shafi'i law, states, slavery is part of Islam. It is permitted to possess women captured in war and to engage in sexual relations with them without their consent. Section M11.13. Even marriage offers no escape. Chapter 4, verse 25 permits Muslims to wed slave women, but ownership remains absolute. A slave's consent to marry is irrelevant. Owners decide. As the medieval scholar Al-Ghazali wrote, the slave has no control over his body or property. Critics argue that Islam encouraged freeing slaves, citing chapter 2, verse 177, righteousness is to believe in Allah and to free slaves. True, freeing slaves is praised as a virtuous act, but it is never mandated. The Quran never abolishes slavery, it merely rewards kindness to slaves. Chapter 4, verse 36. Muhammad himself freed slaves as charity, not because he opposed the institution. The 1926 Treaty of Jeddah banned the slave trade, but Saudi Arabia didn't outlaw slavery until 1962, and Qatar waited until 1967. Even today, Reports of forced marriages and domestic servitude in Gulf states echo Islamic law's legacy. Now, consider the theological implications of slavery. The Quran reduces women to objects of male gratification, likening wives to a field men may cultivate at will. Chapter 2, verse 223. This dehumanizing metaphor extends to slaves. In Sahih Muslim, Book 8, Hadith 3393, a man is punished for sleeping with his wife's slave, not his own. This distinction underscores how Islamic law treats slaves as disposable commodities. Ownership grants absolute power, including sexual access. What about consent? The Quran is silent on the matter, and Islamic law assumes slaves cannot refuse their owners. Muhammad himself said, "A woman's silence is her consent." Sunan Ibn Majah, Hadith 1883. For slaves, this principle is even more sinister. They have no legal autonomy. Chapter 4, verse 25 permits Muslims to marry slave women, but the owner decides if the marriage occurs. If a slave resists, she faces punishment, a practice justified by Chapter 4, verse 34, which permits disciplining disobedient women, and by extension, slaves. The connection between jihad and slavery cannot be ignored. Islam's expansion through warfare ensured a steady supply of captives. After the Battle of Khaybar, Muhammad enslaved Jewish women and distributed them to his followers. Sahih Bukhari, Volume 5, Hadith 592. The Ottoman Empire enslaved millions of Europeans. Arab traders trafficked African women across the Sahara for centuries. These acts were not aberrations, they were sanctioned by Islamic doctrine. Chapter 47, verse 4 frames warfare as a divine duty, while Chapter 8, verse 67 forbids releasing captives unless it serves a strategic purpose. It is not for a prophet to have captives until he has made slaughter in the land. Slaves were both a reward for conquest and a tool to fund future jihad. Modern apologists argue that slavery was a cultural relic of the 7th century. But where does the Quran say this? Nowhere. It never calls for abolition, nor does it frame slavery as temporary. Instead, Islamic law enshrines slavery as a permanent institution. The Mughni, a Hanbali legal text, states, "There is no disagreement among scholars that slavery is permissible." Even the 20th century scholar Yusuf al-Qaradawi, often labeled moderate, affirmed in Fiqh az-Zakat, the poor due on camels and cattle applies to the same categories as those entitled to receive slaves. Slaves were treated as movable property, subject to taxation and trade. What about ISIS? Their 2014 pamphlet on slavery wasn't a distortion, it was a regurgitation of Islamic texts. They quoted Chapter 4, verse 24 and Sahih Muslim, Book 8, Hadith 3433, to justify enslaving Yazidi women. They even permitted prepubescent slaves if physically capable, citing the consensus of early scholars like Ibn Abidin, who wrote in Hashiyat Rad al-Mudir, "Intercourse with a girl under 10 is permissible if she can endure it." This isn't extremism, it's adherence to classical Islamic law. The hypocrisy of no compulsion in religion, Chapter 2, verse 256, becomes glaring when applied to slaves. Enslaved women faced a grotesque choice: convert to Islam or remain a sex slave. Chapter 4, verse 25 promises reward for freeing a slave who converts, a carrot-and-stick tactic that weaponized faith. How voluntary is conversion when your owner owns your body? Muhammad's own concubine, Rayhana bint Zayd, converted after he slaughtered her family and took her as a captive. Her conversion was not a choice, it was survival. In conclusion, the evidence is irrefutable. The Quran, Hadith, and Islamic law sanctify slavery and permit sex with captives. History confirms it, and modern apologists cannot erase this truth with wishful thinking. If you're still clinging to the idea that Islam is inherently peaceful, ask yourself, why did Muhammad own slaves? Why did the Quran codify their exploitation? And why do groups like ISIS cite Islamic texts to justify their atrocities? The answer lies in the unbroken chain of doctrine, law, and practice that has defined Islam's relationship with slavery. Thanks for watching, see you next time.